Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz. It's the beginning of April and high time that I did a wrap-up of the things that I read in March. Now, I finished 14 books in March, which means this will be a longish video. So I will, make sure that I do timestamps and for each of those timestamps give the title and the author and so on of the book that I'm talking about, so that you can hop around and only watch the books that you're interested in, and also you'll find the information there. So it's okay that I won't try and hold up that many books. So quite a varied month, partly I think because there was a number of reading events and readathons that I took part in March, which I didn't sort of wholeheartedly sort of enter into, but I used to vary my reading a bit or help me get to things that I've been meaning to read for a while, and that was certainly effective, because I think I read now 9 newish novels, one fairly recent backlist novel, one older backlist novel, one play, one poetry collection, one book of non-fiction. This month, only 2 of the things I read were in translation, but I think that was partly because I did quite a bit of reading for the BookTube Prize, and that sort of gives a bias towards English. But one of the books that I read in translation was, I would say, probably my top book of the month. And I'm going to start with that. And that was We Do Not Part by Han Kang. Now, Han Kang, as you will know, won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year. This is her newest novel to be available in English translation. She wrote it a couple of years ago, but it came out, just this last month in English. And the translation is by E.Yaewon and Paige, Aniyah Morris. And it was the chosen March book for Reading the Globe Fiction, which is a year-long reading event, and the kind of contemporary fiction strand of it I'm jointly hosting with Katja. And was very happy that we picked this for our March book. I also sort of buddy read it with Ian Powell, who's my Han Kang reading partner, because I've read, I think this must be the 3rd and possibly 4th book that I've read of hers with him. I did a live show about this book with Katja and also with Angelia of Read and Reread, who was one of the booktubers who took part in the discussion of the book on Discord. So I won't go into loads of detail about it, but you might not want to watch an hour-long discussion of the book. So I will quickly say it's a tremendous example of Han Kang's strength as a novelist, because she's quite innovative in her style, but what I think I value about her even more than that is her capacity to write about both the beauty and the cruelty of life. And in this book, she finds a way to revisit a very troubled period in Korea's 20th century history, the Jeju massacre, and writes a lyrical and beautiful and unusual book that also really kind of digs into the truth about what happened and the impact that still has for Korean society and individual Korean people. So it's a book about memory and trauma and loss and So if you have never read anything by Han Kang, I cannot recommend her highly enough, as long as you're prepared to read books that maybe may challenge you both in subject matter and in style, but will bring enormous rewards if you take up that challenge. There you go. So that was my best book of the month, I think, although there were some other real stunners that I'll come to later in this video. Okay. What was my worst book of the month? Well, sometimes there's no really strong contender for that, but this month there absolutely was, because I had to read All Fours by Miranda July for the BookTube Prize. Now, I didn't know I was going to hate this book. It's been it's quite popular. I've heard some people talk really positively about it. It's not a badly written book, okay, but I actively disliked it, and I would have DNF'd it if I hadn't been reading it for the BookTube Prize. Why did I dislike it? It's smart and sassy. It's about a kind of middle-aged American woman having a bit of a kind of midlife crisis, I suppose. And I think she's meant to be a bit of an every woman, but for me, she wasn't an every woman because of her. She's from a very sort of well-off, privileged sort of slice of American society, and that's fine. But it somehow seemed out of touch with most people's reality in a way that didn't work for me. And I found the tone, the humorous sort of tone of the book, ultimately really grating. But if you want to hear more about why I hated it so much, because sometimes I hate say a hate review is fun to watch. Well, you can watch. I made a video about the 6 books that I read for the BookTube Prize, 4 of which I read this month. So we'll talk about the other 3, but relatively briefly because they're all in that video. All 4s was absolutely the only one that I hated. The BookTube Prize did me a favour, I suppose, because it led me to read Helene Bertino's recent novel Beautyland. I say recent, it came out in 2024 in the US and Canada and so on, but it literally became available at the end of March here in the UK, so, hot off the press here. What an interesting book. It's a kind of speculative fiction. The main character, we follow her through her whole life, from sort of, say, early childhood through to the end of her life. She is, or believes she is, you can decide, an alien sent to Earth to report back on kind of human life, human society, and the sort of conditions on Earth. That sounds like it might be a triumph of sort of concept over sort of story or sort of quality of writing. Absolutely not. I was completely bought into the book, and I found it very thoughtful and very insightful, and a book that will really stick with me. The BookTube Prize did me another favour because it got me to read a book by Salih Rooney. Now, I reacted against the Salih Rooney hype, and I've sort of avoided reading Salih Rooney since reading Normal People. But Intermezzo was in my fiction group, so I had to read it, and I'm so glad I did because, it's Rooney won me round. I'm converted back into thinking that she is a really good writer, and again, this is a very sensitive, thoughtful book. It's about relationships, romantic and sexual relationships, but also sibling relationships and parent-child relationships, and how they work and how they can go wrong, and how things like sort of grief or can affect them, how we communicate with each other. Yeah, a lovely book, and I'm very glad I read it. But my favourite of the BookTube Prize books that I read was Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. Now, and that was definitely one of my favourite books of the month. It wasn't for the other BookTube Prize judges in my group, I think, because it didn't make it through to the next round, much to my chagrin. But, there you go. We're all different in our preferences. This was very much the kind of Irish book that I really enjoy. I really relish, I suppose, because it has a really strong sense of place. It's draws on sort of colloquial language of that part of Ireland. It's set in the real sort of back end of Ireland, a sort of small rural town in County Mayo. I mean, no, don't be offended if you live in County Mayo. It's a beautiful place, but it's not glamorous Dublin or well-known Galway or whatever. It's in the middle there, and the plot really engrossed me. I loved it. It was both funny and touching, and the characters and their dialogue absolutely winning. Barrett can write a lovely sentence and a brilliant bit of dialogue. So a book I would warmly recommend, even if, say, my fellow BookTube prize judges obviously didn't love it as much as I did. So now those two books fitted nicely with the fact that March had an Irish readathon and a Celtic readathon, meant I felt I kind of ticked the box for those two. The third book that I read for the Celtic readathon, or more importantly for Duathon, the readathon about reading Welsh books in March, was an absolute win for me, and that was Clear by Carys Davies. Now, that came out in 2024. It had a lot of love on BookTube, I would say, Clear. And, I always worry as to will I sort of think, people have talked it up too much. It's not as good as all that. I didn't have that reaction to Clear. I thought it was a little gem of a book. It's about language and connection. It's historical fiction. It's mostly set on a tiny island, kind of off the coast of Scotland. Well, beyond the coast of Scotland, sort of beyond even Orkney and Shetland, and it's a book about moral choices, and I find that quite intriguing. Tilly and I both read this book, and we're going to make a discussion video about it, so I won't say any more, but other than to say, do read it, and don't, be put off by feeling like there's a bit of a BookTube kind of hype about it. It's truly lovely. Now, reading events can sometimes get me to read a book I've been meaning to read, like Clear, because, I'd heard good things about it. Sometimes they get me to read something that I didn't even know existed, and that can be a real delight. And Angelia of Read and Rereads is running a reading event this year called Endless Drama, suggesting 2 plays to read each month of the year, and I'm joining in and trying to read at least one of those 2 each month. And this month's play that I read was Indecent by Paula Vogel, which was published in 2017. And, I hadn't even heard of this play, but I'm so pleased to have read it. It's kind of historical fiction again, funnily enough. And it's based around a play that was written in Yiddish in 1907. So Sholem Asch's play, God of Vengeance. And it traces its kind of quite positive reception initially, like where it was written and being, and in Germany and around Europe, and and we get repeated little sort of mini performances of the play again and again, and then sort of how it was. I'm not explaining this very well, but that it uses the dramatic form, I suppose, to visit how it's received in different places, and then it's translated into English and it's performed in the USA, and it has one kind of positive experience. And then someone decides to put it on Broadway in 1923. And, this is a true story. The Broadway production, the cast and the production team were all arrested because it was considered indecent. Because it shows a loving sexual relationship between 2 women. How striking for a play written in 1907, how fascinating that it could be, shown around Europe, and then, when it came to be performed on Broadway, that British shock and horror. How interesting how the original, it also shows how the original author felt about it by that point, and questions about what it meant to him to write a play sort of in Yiddish about a sort of Jewish theme, trying to create a new kind of Yiddish Jewish literature, and then how that might be interpreted, in the America of the 1920s as well. So really interesting. and I'm so thank you, Angelia, for getting me to watch that. Read that. Did I say watch it? Well, it's a play. You should watch them, really, shouldn't you? I haven't managed to find one to watch, but I've watched some excerpts. Oh, apologies for the coughing. Now, sometimes I use events to read something that I've been meaning to read. Okay, and another March event is Herstoryathon, which is hosted by Charlotte of Queenie Reads, and that's drawing on the fact that March is Women's History Month and saying read some non-fiction about women's history. And I've been meaning since it came out to read Difficult Women by Helen Lewis. Came out in 2020. It's sort of subtitle explains the book quite well. A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. So yeah, very much women's history. I suppose what Lewis is trying to do in this book is remind us how hard won some of the rights that we might almost take for granted now were, and how our four mothers and four sisters had to battle to achieve those things. So, the vote is an obvious one, but also things like reproductive rights, now under threat in some places, of course, the right to divorce, multiple, 11 different things she focuses on. But what made this book interesting, particularly interesting, and meant that it told me more than things I already knew, I suppose, was she looks at how you have to be the woman that fights those fights, and how that can mean that you're actually not necessarily a likable person, not necessarily in every respect someone that we might now admire. Classic example, which she goes into, is Mary Stopes. Amazing work she did in making contraception available to women. But in order to do that, she kind of compromised on some things that we might have expected to be part of that. She was very much thinking in terms of making it accessible to married women. But, perhaps because she knew that you could only take things so far at that point. But the other thing is that she espoused quite distasteful eugenicist views. And, that sort of nuanced mixture was one of the pleasures of the book for me. Another reading event that I used to pick up something that I sort of has been on my sort of long list of things to read was back to Reading the Globe, Katya's event, and she's got a classics sort of thread for that as well. And the March-April book for that classics thread was The Season of Migration to the North, which is a book from 1966 by Sudanese author Tayeb Salih. I read a translation into English by Dennis Johnson Davies. It's one of those books that is really, really interesting. Definitely a modern classic of writing, and a very significant book, I suppose, in sort of 20th century literature in Arabic. But equally, one of those books that was not entirely a pleasure to read, despite being absolutely fascinating. Why do I say that? The interesting elements is a book about colonialism and about the tensions thrown up when the sort of someone from a colonized nation goes to the colonial nation's homeland, and the sort of almost collision of cultures and values that can result from that, and what's the impact of that on that person, and it's a multi-layered narrative. What did I like best about it? That the ideas, but also gorgeous description of sort of life in sort of a rural part of Sudan in the 1960s. Absolutely took me there, and I loved that. But it carried a kind of degree of sort of sexist attitudes, which are totally, in keeping with the period, I guess, you know, of the 1960s, but there were just too many references to women's white thighs opening, and so, you know, that became a little bit tiresome. But also, it has a sort of, there's an odd quality to it, which I both found interesting, but also slightly, I wasn't quite sure. I suppose it's one of those books that leaves you slightly disconcerted. If you have read it too, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And it's a book that I would like to get to discuss with other people, because it left me with sort of so many uncertainties, I suppose. Now, two books that I read this month were ones that I've been meaning to get to for a while, and not linked to anything. I read them just because, and that's always nice, isn't it? And they're both from the 20-teens. And one of those is Women Talking by Miriam Toews from 2018. Now, she's a Canadian writer. She grew up in a Mennonite community and really draws on that in her fiction. And people have been telling me that I must read a book by Miriam Toews, and that book or one of her others for it feels like years. Well, certainly about 7 years. And finally, I got around to it. And thank you, Angelia, for agreeing to buddy read this with me this month, so that I actually finally got to it, instead of it just sitting on that long list. And I think both of us were just utterly caught up in this book, in this story, which is interesting because it's quite, the way it's told is quite static. You know, it's set in a hayloft, a group of women sitting in that hayloft, just talking, as the title says. You know, they're talking to each other, and there's one man there who is acting as their scribe, and so is hence the narrator, because he is the only one amongst them who is literate, who can write, because in this Mennonite community, women are not allowed to have any education, really. And what these women are sitting talking about, debating, is how they're going to deal with the fact that they now know that some men in their community have been knocking them out at night, you know, anaesthetising them and raping them, and raping many of the women in the community of all ages. And those men who have done that it's a small community, a closed community. They're cousins and their brothers and their friends' fathers and their friends' sons, and you know, how do you deal with that? And then the fact that the other men in the community, apart from this one who's with them, have gone to the city to try and bail out these men, these rapists, these confessed rapists. It's a book about patriarchy and about how religion is used in the cause to sustain patriarchy. But it's also about the relationships between the women and how they kind of find a way of like taking these awful events and almost using them to take back some power and authority in their lives and rethink their lives. Great book. Really glad to have read it. There you go. Now, the other thing that I kind of got around to that I've been meaning to, and for, you know, not linked to anything, was the book of poetry that I read. And this is a book by Fiona Benson. She's a British poet that I admire. I've read a couple of her collections and I always meant to pick up another. And this one was from 2014. It's called Bright Travellers. I know that there are a few of us here on BookTube that enjoy reading poetry. So for those people, I would say, if you haven't read Fiona Benson yet, do. She's at that sweet point between sort of ideas and emotions in her poetry and a real focus on sort of poetic form and style and use of language. So a warm recommendation for the lovers of contemporary poetry on here. Finally, I'm going to wind up with 3 newly published contemporary fiction novels, all of which have been published in 2025. And 2 of them I've already talked about in a standalone review. But first, I will start with the one that I haven't. Okay, and that's all. My goodness. Just chuck a library book on the floor, Ros, why don't you? It's all right. It's unharmed. Look, CC, it's unharmed. Okay, Victorian Psycho by Virginia Feito. She's Spanish, but writes in English. She came to university in English, and I don't know why, but she chose it probably because it's although she now lives back in Madrid, I think it probably gives her work a wider audience. I don't know. Not that there's a huge Spanish-speaking world to write in, isn't there? But as I say, she writes in English. And this book, came out in January, and I kind of had it sort of half in mind to read and on hold from the library, but was really spurred to get to it in March because of another readathon. Bit of a theme here. And that was Emily of Novell Novels did a Bronte readathon in March. Now, I did get to dig into that as much as I could have done, given how much I enjoy and am fascinated by the Brontes. But I did get to read this. And one of her prompts was to read a dark book. And this absolutely fits the bill for that. And some, because as it says, Victorian Psycho, you can tell this is kind of inspired by Victorian Gothic novels, but mashes that together, I suppose, with the style of modern horror and almost Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of approach by the end of the book. It's angry and funny and vivid and tongue-in-cheek, but also satisfying. And it, when I say it's inspired by Victorian Gothic, it pleased me because it's got those tropes. It's got a governess and a rambling country house and a family with some dark secrets and some odd siblings and all of those things that you might sort of, and servants' hall tensions and things that you recognise from a Victorian novel, but as I say, combined with some quite gruesome sort of horror. It's not really my sort of book, I suppose, but I'm glad I read it. It was a lot of fun to read, and quite a quick read too. It's sort of, it's not long and it's well spread out, and if it's your sort of thing, you will absolutely love it, I think. Next up that was published in January. This one came out in February, and as it's A House for Miss Pauline by Diana Macaulay. She's a well-respected, highly thought of author in Jamaica. I'm ashamed to say I've never read anything by her before, but I'm very glad I read this one. I've done a standalone review video of it because I thought it was a really tremendous book. Why did I like it so much? It's more unlike Victorian Gothic. This is more of a typical Rose book, I suppose, because it has a really strong sense of place. It's set in rural Jamaica, up in the hills. It has lovely kind of fluent writing style. It uses quite a lot of Jamaican patois in the novel, which, but in a way that is accessible to a reader who's not from Jamaica. But it's got lots of ideas in it. It's about land and inheritance and, who owns land and why, and but also about connection, human connection, family connections. And the absolute best thing about the book for me is the central protagonist, the titular Miss Pauline, who is 99, nearly 100, and is the most sort of fierce, feisty, enjoyable main character. I defy you not to love reading about Miss Pauline. So that was that one. And then very last book I'm going to talk about, and another book that I really enjoyed, quite a contrast in that if Miss Pauline is that it's a book that really engages you emotionally. This is a much more intellectual book, but really smart and really thought-provoking and extraordinarily well written. So it's Universality by Natasha Brown. It came out in March, at the beginning of March, and I was, thank you to my amazing library service, I was able to read it within weeks of it, a couple of weeks of it coming out. If you recognise the name Natasha Brown, it's because her debut novel Assembly was a big hit on BookTube and critically kind of acclaimed. One of the sort of books of the year, I suppose, of the year it came out, which was, I think 2021. And so this was sort of a hugely anticipated second novel and really hit the spot for me. It's about, the thing I like about Natasha Brown is that she takes on the big controversial topics, like diversity and privilege and class and race and cancel culture and all of that, but not in a kind of obvious way. It's nuanced and subtle and thoughtful, and I highly recommend this if you are interested in a book that's more about ideas, and it has characters that you can engage with, but it's not. It's a book of where you get multiple versions of a story and multiple versions, perspectives, I suppose, and rather than a sort of linear plot and a main character that you can latch onto, but really well worth your time. So that was my March. That was a lot of books and a long video. As always, do comment if you read any of these or you want to read any of them, if you agree with me about them, if you disagree with me about them, if you've got questions you want to ask me about them. We'll always respond to your comments, and I really appreciate and enjoy the conversation.